In the grand hall where power echoed through stone walls carved with the history of conquest and dominion, where the scent of authority hung heavy in the air like incense burning at the altar of hierarchy, a moment of truth would shatter carefully maintained illusions about strength, fear, and the delicate balance between control and freedom that governed the lives of all who dwelt within the shad. Ow of the crown. Kaya Rune stood at the periphery of noble society, an Omega whose bloodline carried just enough distinction to grant her access to royal gatherings, while never allowing her to forget her place in the carefully orchestrated dance of submission and dominance that defined pack relationships. Born to minor nobility that had fallen from grace through her father's political miscalculations, she existed in the uncomfortable space between belonging and exile, accepted enough to attend court functions, but never truly welcomed among those whose power remained unquestioned. The Alpha King's court represented the pinnacle of hierarchical perfection, where every gesture carried meaning, every word held consequence, and every interaction reinforced the natural order that kept wolves in their proper places through a system of respect and fear that had maintained stability for generations. Here, in chambers where kings had ruled and nobles had schemed, the careful balance between strength and submission created an atmosphere where even the slightest misstep could have devastating consequences. Prince Eric's Valcor moved through this world like a force of nature barely contained within human form, his presence commanding immediate attention and instant submission from those wise enough to recognize the danger that lurked behind eyes that had seen too much and learned to trust too little. As heir to the most powerful throne in the Northern Territories, he carried the weight of future responsibility alongside the burden of a reputation that spoke of cold calculation and merciless efficiency in dealing with those who challenged royal authority. But reputation, like the carefully constructed facades that court life demanded, often concealed truths too complex for public understanding or comfortable acceptance. Behind the mask of controlled cruelty that protected both prince and kingdom from the chaos that unchecked power could unleash lay struggles that few could comprehend, and none dared to acknowledge in the presence of authority that demanded respect through fear rather than earning loyalty through understanding. The evening's festivities had proceeded according to ancient protocols that transformed social interaction into elaborate theater, where every participant played their assigned role with practiced precision, where conversations flowed according to unspoken rules that reinforced hierarchy while providing the illusion of voluntary participation in traditions that had bound wolves to their proper stay. Tie-ins for countless generations. Wine had loosened tongues while strengthening inhibitions, creating the perfect environment for maintaining established order through collective enforcement of behavioral expectations. Among the assembled nobility, conversations had turned to topics that allowed for the safe expression of opinions within carefully defined boundaries, where agreement with established wisdom demonstrated loyalty, while dissent remained confined to matters of minor significance that posed no threat to fundamental power structures. It was within this context of controlled discourse that circumstances would align to create a moment of truth that challenged everything the court understood about proper behavior and appropriate consequences. The Omega, who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of minor nobility through careful observation and strategic silence, carried within her spirit that had been shaped by loss and hardship, but never broken by circumstances that would have crushed souls less resilient or determined. Her father's fall from grace had taught her harsh lessons about the fragility of position and the importance of personal integrity when external validation could disappear without warning, leaving only character as foundation for whatever future could be built from the ruins of fallen expectations. Tonight, in halls where her presence represented both privilege and precarious positioning, words would be spoken that transformed careful observation into active participation, strategic silence into bold declaration, and personal integrity into public challenge that would force everyone present to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of power and the courage required to speak authentically. Callie in the face of authority that demanded submission through fear, rather than earning respect through justice. The Alpha King's son would discover that fear, however carefully cultivated and systematically enforced, could not silence truth, when spoken by someone with nothing left to lose, and everything to gain through honest expression of principles that transcended personal safety. The court would learn that hierarchy, however firmly established and religiously maintained, remained vulnerable to challenges that exposed the difference between authority based on strength and power, derived from authentic leadership that served justice rather than convenience. In chambers where silence had always equaled safety and submission had guaranteed survival, an Omega with a voice would speak words that echoed with the force of truth, creating ripples that would spread far beyond the immediate moment to reshape understanding of courage, consequence, and the complex relationship between those who rule and those who submit to rule by choice rather than compulsion. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the great hall, their light fragmenting through cut glass to create patterns that shifted with each current of air stirred by the movement of nobility who gathered for the evening's formal reception. Wine flowed freely from silver decanters, loosening tongues while paradoxically strengthening the invisible bonds of protocol that kept conversations within acceptable boundaries of court discourse. Kaya stood near one of the tall windows that overlooked the castle's formal gardens, her position carefully chosen to provide observation of court dynamics while avoiding the center of attention that her uncertain status made dangerous to occupy for extended periods. As daughter of Lord Aldrich Roon, whose political miscalculations had cost their family much of their influence and nearly all of their wealth, she walked a careful line between maintaining dignity and acknowledging the reduced circumstances that made her presence at court dependent upon royal tolerance rather than inherited right. The evening's entertainment had proceeded according to established patterns that reinforced hierarchy through ritualized social interaction, where younger nobles demonstrated their understanding of proper behavior, while their elders evaluated performance against standards that determined future opportunities for advancement within the complex web of relationships that surrounded royal power like protective barriers. Lady Kaya, Lord Bennet approached with the sort of calculated friendliness that characterized interactions with those whose status remained uncertain, but whose potential utility could not be entirely dismissed. You appear thoughtful this evening. Perhaps the company fails to meet your expectations. Not at all, Lord Bennet, she replied with diplomatic politeness that acknowledged his attention, while avoiding any statement that could be interpreted as criticism of royal hospitality or assembled nobility. I find court gatherings endlessly instructive regarding the subtleties of social interaction and political positioning. Indeed, observation can be most educational for those willing to learn from the examples set by their betters, he agreed with tone that managed to be simultaneously complimentary and condescending, emphasizing her position as student rather than peer in the complex hierarchies that governed court relationships. Though I sometimes wonder, Kaya continued with careful consideration of her words, whether what appears to be strength might sometimes be performance, and what seems like wisdom might occasionally be simply the repetition of accepted formulas that have never been properly examined for their actual merit. The mild philosophical observation would have passed without comment in most circumstances, representing the sort of abstract intellectual discussion that demonstrated education without challenging specific authorities or questioning particular policies. But Lord Bennet's eyes sharpened with interest that suggested her words had touched upon considerations more significant than casual conversation warranted. An interesting perspective, he replied with renewed attention, that transformed casual exchange into something approaching genuine dialogue, though one might ask whether inexperience might mistake performance for authenticity, or whether established wisdom might seem formulaic only to those who lack sufficient understanding of its foundations. A fair point, Kaya acknowledged with smile that demonstrated appreciation for intellectual challenge while maintaining the respectful tone that protocol demanded. Though I would suggest that true strength reveals itself through consistency between public behavior and private character, while authentic wisdom demonstrates its value through results that serve justice rather than merely maintain comfortable arrangements for those who benefit from established systems. The conversation had drawn attention from nearby groups, whose own discussions had grown stale through repetition of familiar topics and rehearsal of accepted opinions that offered little opportunity for genuine intellectual engagement or meaningful exploration of ideas that might challenge conventional understanding of complex issues affecting territorial governance and social organization. Miss Roon presents interesting arguments regarding the relationship between appearance and reality in matters of leadership and authority, Lord Bennet announced to the expanding circle of listeners, his tone suggesting that her contributions might provide entertainment through their naive freshness, rather than serious consideration of philosophical principles that governed political relations. Does she indeed? Lord Garrett responded with amusement that emphasized the presumption involved in minor nobility, offering perspectives on matters properly reserved for those whose experience and education qualified them to evaluate complex questions of governance and social organization. Perhaps she would share her insights regarding specific examples of such discrepancies between performance and authenticity. I would hesitate to offer specific critiques that might be interpreted as personal criticism rather than general philosophical observation, Kaya replied with diplomatic caution that acknowledged the dangerous territory such discussion could enter, while maintaining her position that principles deserved examination regardless of their current acceptance among established authorities. How tactful, came a new voice from behind her, carrying tones of cold amusement that sent immediate silence rippling through the assembled group as recognition of the speaker transformed casual conversation into moment of acute tension, where every word would carry heightened significance and potential consequence. Prince Eric's Valcor had approached with the predatory grace that characterized all his movements, his presence commanding immediate attention, while creating atmosphere of barely controlled danger that reminded everyone present of the power he represented and the careful respect his proximity demanded. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that seemed to absorb light, and eyes that held depths no one dared to fathom completely, he embodied authority that required no announcement or introduction. "Your Highness," Lord Bennet said with bow that demonstrated proper protocol, while his voice carried undertones of nervousness that the prince's unexpected participation in their conversation had created. Lady Kaya was sharing philosophical observations regarding leadership and authenticity that the assembled company found instructive. "Philosophical observations," Prince Eric's repeated with tone that transformed the phrase into something approaching mockery. How refreshing to encounter such intellectual courage from someone whose own family's understanding of authentic leadership proved so remarkably inadequate when tested by practical circumstances. The reference to her father's political failures sent heat rising in Kaya's cheeks, while creating uncomfortable silence among witnesses who recognized the prince's words as deliberate provocation, designed to test her response under pressure that could reveal character traits not apparent through casual social interaction. The insult demanded response, while making any response potentially dangerous, given the vast disparity in their relative positions and power. "Your Highness speaks truthfully regarding my family's mistakes," she replied, with voice that remained steady despite emotional turmoil his words had created. "Though I might suggest that learning from others' failures could provide more valuable education than never being tested by circumstances that reveal whether authority serves justice or merely protects convenience for those fortunate enough to inherit power without earning wisdom. Might you indeed?" Prince Eric stepped closer with movement that transformed their exchange from public conversation into confrontation, where his physical presence emphasized the political gulf between them, while his tone carried warning that further challenge might cross lines that even royal tolerance would not permit her to transgress safely. "I might," Kaya confirmed, with voice that carried conviction despite recognition that her response was leading toward territory where retreat might be impossible, and advance could prove catastrophic for both personal safety and family welfare that remained dependent upon royal mercy rather than inherited protection. "And what specific wisdom would you offer regarding the proper exercise of authority, given your family's demonstrated expertise in leadership principles?" His words dripped with sarcasm that emphasized both her inferior position and his supreme confidence in his ability to destroy whatever remained of her social standing through public humiliation that would serve as warning to others who might consider similar presumption. "I would suggest that true authority inspires respect rather than demanding fear, serves justice rather than protecting privilege, and demonstrates strength through protection of vulnerable rather than intimidation of those who lack power to resist systematic oppression disguised as natural hierarchy." "How wonderfully naive," Prince Eric's replied with smile that held no warmth while his eyes promised consequences for continuing to challenge royal heir, whose patience with philosophical debate was approaching limits that prudence should have warned her not to test further. "And I suppose you consider yourself qualified to evaluate whether royal authority meets such elevated standards?" I consider myself qualified to recognize the difference between strength and cruelty, between justice and convenience, between leadership that serves subjects and authority that serves itself, through systematic enforcement of hierarchies that protect powerful while oppressing vulnerable members of society. Do you indeed? Prince Eric's voice had grown quiet with tone that experienced courtiers recognized as far more dangerous than open anger, while his stillness suggested predator preparing to strike at prey, foolish enough to continue provoking confrontation that could only end in disaster for the weaker party. I do, Kaya replied with conviction that surprised her, despite recognition that she was challenging authority that could destroy her with single word to appropriate officials. And unlike others present, I'm not sufficiently impressed by title and tradition to pretend that intimidation represents authentic strength or that systematic cruelty demonstrates effective leadership. Unlike others present, Prince Eric's repeated with voice that had become dangerously soft, while his attention focused upon her with intensity that made several nearby nobles step back from proximity to confrontation that seemed to be approaching violence. You lack sufficient wisdom to recognize appropriate behavior in the presence of authority that has been earned through methods you could not comprehend or survive. Your authority may have been earned through methods I couldn't survive, Kaya acknowledged with honesty that demonstrated respect for his capabilities, while refusing to concede the fundamental point about character that their entire exchange had circled around. But that doesn't change the fact that using such authority to intimidate those who lack power to resist represents choice rather than necessity, cruelty rather than strength, convenience rather than justice. And you believe yourself capable of making such distinctions regarding royal behavior and motivations? Prince Eric's asked with tone that suggested her presumption had finally crossed whatever invisible lines his patience had been willing to tolerate, while his posture indicated that consequences for her audacity were about to manifest through demonstration of exactly why others showed proper respect for royal authority. I believe myself capable of recognizing fear when I see it, Kaya replied with words that emerged before conscious thought could intervene to prevent utterance of truth that challenged not just his authority, but the fundamental assumptions about power relationships that maintained stable hierarchy throughout territorial social organization. Fear? Prince Eric's voice carried genuine surprise alongside growing anger that her continued defiance was generating, despite obvious warnings that prudence should have heeded. You believe I fear you, little Omega? No, Your Highness, Kaya said, with voice that carried certainty, despite recognition that her next words would either transform their confrontation into something approaching mutual understanding or trigger consequences that would demonstrate exactly why others chose submission over honest communication with authority that preferred comfortable compliance to authentic interaction. You don't scare me. The words hung in the air like thunder that preceded lightning, their simple syllables carrying weight that transformed the glittering court gathering into tableau of frozen anticipation, where every breath seemed suspended, every heartbeat silenced by the magnitude of what had just been spoken in the presence of witnesses who could not unhear truth that challenged every assumption about proper behavior and appropriate consequences. Prince Eric stood motionless for heartbeats that stretched into eternity, his dark eyes fixed upon Kaya's face with intensity that seemed to search for signs of fear or recognition of the catastrophic mistake her honesty had created. Around them, nobility who had moments before been engaged in comfortable conversations about inconsequential matters, now pressed closer, despite instinctive understanding that proximity to such confrontation invited association with whatever terrible punishment was about to unfold. You don't scare me, Kaya had said, and the truth of those words resonated through the hall like bell-tolling announcement that could not be recalled or softened through subsequent explanation. There had been no calculation in their utterance, no strategic consideration of political consequences or personal safety, merely honest response to challenge that had demanded authentic reply rather than diplomatic evasion. Extraordinary, murmured Lord Garrett, with voice barely audible above collective intake of breath that accompanied recognition of unprecedented boldness from Omega, who had just committed what conventional wisdom considered social suicide through direct challenge to royal heir, whose reputation for dealing with disrespect was well established among those wise enough to avoid testing his patience. Completely unprecedented, agreed Lady Margaret with fascination that overcome caution, as historical significance of moment began penetrating understanding of witnesses, who realized they were observing events that would be discussed and analyzed for generations regardless of immediate consequences that such confrontation might generate. Prince Eric's continued studying Kaya's face with attention that seemed to catalog every detail of expression, seeking evidence of bravado masking terror, or perhaps discovering genuine courage that his experience had taught him to believe impossible among those who lacked sufficient power to challenge royal authority without facing immediate and devastating retaliation for their presumption. "You don't scare me," he repeated her words with voice that carried wonder alongside growing anger, as if testing their reality through repetition that might reveal hidden meaning or alternative interpretation that could explain audacity that seemed to defy every principle of survival and rational self-interest that governed behavior of intelligent creatures. "No, Your Highness," Kaya confirmed with voice that remained steady, despite recognition that she had crossed lines from which retreat was impossible, while advance promised only greater danger through continued honesty about perceptions that conventional wisdom would have demanded she suppress through diplomatic silence. "And why?" Prince Eric's asked, with tone that had grown dangerously quiet, while his stillness suggested predator evaluating prey that had failed to display appropriate fear, despite obvious disparity in strength and position that should have triggered immediate submission through recognition of hopeless disadvantage. "Should I not inspire appropriate respect from Omega who lacks power to resist consequences that disrespect inevitably attracts? Because fear and respect are different things, Your Highness," Kaya replied with voice that carried conviction, despite emotional chaos that confronting royal authority had created within her. "And because authentic strength doesn't require intimidation of those who pose no threat to demonstrate superiority that should be evident through character rather than systematic cruelty." "Authentic strength," Prince Eric's mused with tone that suggested her words had touched upon considerations more complex than simple evaluation of appropriate behavior toward challenging subjects, while his expression shifted through emotions too quickly for observers to interpret accurately, despite obvious significance of internal struggle her honesty had provoked. "Yes, Your Highness. Authentic strength that serves justice rather than convenience, protects vulnerable rather than oppressing them, inspires loyalty through example rather than demanding submission through intimidation that proves weakness disguised as authority. And you believe yourself qualified to evaluate royal character according to such elevated standards?" he asked with voice that carried curiosity alongside anger, as if her perspective offered insights that conventional court flattery had never provided despite years of receiving praise designed to reinforce royal preferences rather than challenging assumptions about leadership effectiveness. "I believe myself qualified to recognize the difference between strength and cruelty, between justice and systematic oppression, between leadership that serves subjects and authority that serves itself through convenient arrangements that protect powerful while sacrificing vulnerable to maintenance of comfortable hierarchies." "Remarkable," came new voice from edge of gathering, where movement had drawn attention to approaching figure whose presence commanded immediate transformation of atmosphere, from tense confrontation between Prince and Omega to situation of supreme political significance, where every word would carry consequences extending far beyond personal relationship between primary participants. Alpha King Morvain Valcor moved through assembled nobility, with authority that made his son's intimidating presence seem merely preparatory exercise for encountering true power, his bearing suggesting depths of experience and capability that transcended individual understanding, while commanding respect through achievements that had shaped territorial stability for decades rather than years of royal privilege. "Your Majesty," Prince Eric said with bow that demonstrated filial respect, while his voice carried undertones of uncertainty about paternal reaction to confrontation that had drawn royal attention through its unprecedented nature and potential implications for court order that depended upon appropriate behavior from all participants, regardless of individual feelings about hierarchy. "Eric's," the king acknowledged with tone that revealed nothing about his assessment of situation. He had observed developing through conversation that had transformed philosophical discussion into direct challenge to royal authority by Omega, whose position made such challenge simultaneously audacious and potentially catastrophic for established order. "Lady Kaya Rune," King Morvain continued with attention, that focused upon her with intensity, that made previous confrontation with Prince seem merely preliminary evaluation, before encountering authority that had power to reshape her entire existence through single decision about appropriate response to unprecedented breach of protocol. "Your Majesty," Kaya replied with bow that demonstrated proper respect, while her voice carried awareness that royal attention represented either opportunity for salvation through mercy or confirmation of doom through official recognition of offense that demanded punishment severe enough to serve as warning against similar presumption. "You have made quite an impression this evening," the king observed with tone that provided no indication whether such impression had been positive or negative, despite obvious significance for determining consequences that royal judgment would impose upon situation that had challenged fundamental assumptions about court behavior. "I apologize if my words have caused offense, Your Majesty," Kaya said with diplomatic courtesy that acknowledged potential wrongdoing while avoiding specific admission of guilt that might complicate whatever mercy royal wisdom might be inclined to extend toward Omega, whose honesty had created complications for established order. "Offense?" King Morvain repeated with voice that carried amusement alongside more complex emotions that witnesses found impossible to interpret accurately, despite obvious importance of royal reaction for determining immediate consequences and broader implications for court governance that depended upon consistent enforcement of behavioral expectations. "I find myself intrigued rather than offended by Omega, who speaks truth in presence of authority that others approach with diplomatic evasion, designed to avoid uncomfortable honesty about complex realities of leadership and governance that conventional wisdom prefers to ignore through comfortable assumptions." The royal response sent shock through assembled witnesses who had expected harsh punishment for unprecedented breach of protocol. Instead, discovering apparent approval for honesty that challenged established patterns of court interaction through direct communication that avoided convenient diplomatic formulas designed to protect comfort rather than serve truth. Furthermore, King Morvain continued with decision that would reshape understanding of royal character and governmental philosophy, "I believe such perspective could serve valuable function within court environment that has perhaps grown too comfortable with flattery that reinforces assumptions, rather than challenging leadership to examine effectiveness of current approaches to territorial governance and social organization." "Your Majesty?" Prince Erix asked, with voice that carried confusion about paternal direction that seemed to approve unprecedented challenge to royal authority, rather than punishing breach of protocol that conventional wisdom would have demanded, receive immediate and severe consequences for maintaining established order. "I hereby declare Lady Kaya Rune appointed to position of royal advisor, with specific responsibility for providing honest evaluation of court policies and governmental effectiveness, without diplomatic constraints that normally limit such communication to comfortable praise, rather than constructive criticism that serves improvement over convenience." The announcement sent waves of astonishment through assembled nobility, who struggled to process royal decision that transformed Omega's audacious confrontation with heir into elevation to position of unprecedented authority and responsibility within governmental structure that had never included such role or recognized value of systematic honesty over diplomatic courtesy. Moreover, the king continued with decision that would create even greater shock among witnesses who thought they had witnessed maximum possible surprise. Given nature of responsibilities that such position entails, and necessity of close cooperation between advisor and heir apparent, Lady Kaya will be assigned to Prince Erix's household, with authority to observe and evaluate all aspects of Roya. A leadership preparation and territorial administration. Assignment that will require intimate familiarity with royal decision-making processes, administrative procedures, and personal character traits that affect leadership effectiveness, he explained with tone that suggested careful consideration of arrangement's implications despite sudden nature of decision that transformed confrontation into opportunity for unprecedented cooperation. "Your Majesty," Kaya said, with voice that struggled to process transformation of circumstances from potential disaster into elevation that exceeded anything her background or current position could have justified through conventional advancement. "I am honored by royal confidence, but uncertain whether my experience qualifies me for responsibilities that such position would entail." "Your experience with honesty and courage qualifies you for responsibilities that conventional advisors cannot fulfill through diplomatic training that emphasizes comfort over accuracy," King Morvain replied, with conviction that demonstrated decision had been based upon careful evaluation, rather than impulsive reaction to unprecedented situation. Furthermore, Your demonstrated ability to recognize truth regardless of personal consequences suggests perspective that royal governance requires but rarely receives through normal channels that prioritize agreement over constructive challenge to assumptions that may require examination and potential modification. As implications of royal decision continued expanding through assembly where witnesses struggled to understand transformation that had converted anticipated punishment into unprecedented elevation, Kaya found herself confronting future that would test every assumption about her capabilities while providing opportunity to serve justice through honest evaluation of royal governance that convention. Wisdom had never permitted. Looking toward Prince Eric's, whose expression revealed complex mixture of anger, confusion, and something that might have been relief at having authority challenge his assumptions, while providing structure for examining leadership effectiveness through perspective that court flattery had never offered, Kaya realized that her truth-telling had created consequences beyond anything imagination could be anticipated. The Omega who had refused to demonstrate fear had discovered that honesty could inspire royal confidence rather than triggering punishment, while confrontation that seemed destined to end in disaster had transformed into opportunity for serving justice through systematic evaluation of governmental effectiveness that required courage to speak truth, regardless of personal consequences for comfort or convenience. The royal chambers allocated to Kaya's new position as royal advisor exceeded anything her reduced family circumstances had prepared her to expect, their luxury emphasizing transformation from minor nobility of uncertain standing into court official whose responsibilities required proximity to royal authority and access to sensitive information that conventional hierarchy would never have permitted someone of her background to possess. 3 weeks had passed since King Morvain's shocking decree, during which court dynamics had shifted around her presence like water, adjusting to foreign object, that changed familiar currents through gravitational effects that influenced everyone within range of political implications that her appointment had created. Some nobles approached with careful courtesy that acknowledged royal support, while concealing personal feelings about unprecedented elevation, while others maintained polite distance that avoided association with experiment, whose ultimate success remained uncertain. Prince Eric's had initially responded to forced cooperation with cold efficiency that fulfilled letter of royal command, while making clear his personal feelings about having household management subjected to systematic observation and evaluation by Omega, whose qualifications consisted entirely of courage to speak uncomfortable truths, rather than practical experience with territorial governance or military administration that his responsibilities encompassed. "Lady Kaya," he had said during their first official meeting, his tone carrying professional courtesy that barely concealed irritation at circumstances that required him to explain decisions and policies to someone whose advice he neither sought nor valued, despite paternal command that made cooperation mandatory. "What specific aspects of royal administration interest you most for initial evaluate?" Ion. "Your Highness, I would prefer to observe normal operations before forming opinions about specific policies or procedures," she had replied with diplomatic approach that balanced honest assessment with recognition that effective cooperation required understanding context before attempting evaluation that served improvement rather than mere criticism. Normal operations that include territorial defense coordination, administrative oversight of 12 regional governors, judicial review of complex legal cases, diplomatic negotiations with neighboring territories, and strategic planning for economic development that affects hundreds of thousands of subjects whose welfare depends upon effective decision-making. "I understand the scope of responsibilities is vast and complex, Your Highness. Perhaps beginning with observation of daily routine would provide foundation for understanding how various obligations interconnect, while revealing areas where external perspective might offer useful insights." The diplomatic exchange had established pattern of careful cooperation that satisfied royal command, while allowing both parties to maintain dignity, despite artificial nature of arrangement that neither had chosen voluntarily. Over subsequent weeks, professional relationship had developed that surprised both participants through discovery of mutual respect that transcended initial antagonism, despite fundamental differences in background and perspective. Kaya's observations had revealed aspects of royal responsibility that court gossip never encompassed, complexities of governance that simple criticism of authoritarian behavior failed to acknowledge adequately. Prince Eric's carried burdens that would have crushed weaker individuals, making decisions that affected thousands of lives while receiving little appreciation for successful outcomes, and complete blame for anything that went wrong, despite circumstances often beyond individual control. The Northbrook territorial dispute requires resolution before harvest season affects economic stability throughout region, Prince Eriks explained during morning briefing that had become routine part of administrative oversight, his voice carrying weariness that suggested sleepless nights spent reviewing legal precedents and strategic options for addressing conflict that threatened regional prosperity. Eridai. What specific factors complicate resolution that conventional diplomatic approaches have failed to address effectively? Kaya asked with genuine interest that had replaced initial skepticism about royal decision-making processes through recognition that simple solutions rarely existed for complex problems affecting multiple constituencies with competing interests. Factors including water rights that affect agricultural productivity, mining claims that influence economic development, traditional territorial boundaries that conflict with practical resource management, and family feuds that have persisted across generations while preventing rational discussion of mutual interests. And what approaches has royal administration attempted for addressing these multiple complications simultaneously rather than dealing with individual issues separately? Approaches that include mediated negotiations that failed through stubborn adherence to historical grievances, economic incentives that proved insufficient for overcoming traditional animosities, legal arbitration that satisfied no one while creating additional resentment about royal interference, and threat of military intervention that would destabilize region while solving nothing permanently. The honest assessment revealed frustration with limitations that even royal authority faced when dealing with human nature, and deeply rooted conflicts that resisted rational resolution, despite obvious benefits that cooperation would provide for everyone involved. Such candor about governmental limitations demonstrated trust that had developed through weeks of professional interaction, despite artificial origins of their cooperation. "Your Highness," Kaya said with careful consideration of suggestion that might overstep appropriate boundaries, while offering perspective that conventional advisors perhaps could not provide through diplomatic constraints. What if resolution focused on future benefits rather than past grievances, creating new framework for cooperation that acknowledged historical concerns while establishing practical advantages that served everyone's immediate interests? Such approach would require both parties to accept that past injustices receive less attention than current opportunities for mutual prosperity, Prince Eriks replied, with tone that suggested he had considered similar possibilities, while doubting their practical implementation, given human tendency to prioritize emotional satisfaction over rational self-interest. True, though emotional satisfaction might emerge through success, that proved cooperation served justice, better than continued conflict that benefits no one while perpetuating suffering, that honors past grievances through present misery. Interesting perspective, he acknowledged with first genuine approval she had received for advisory input since appointment began. Though implementation would require careful management of expectations while providing tangible benefits quickly enough to overcome skepticism about royal motives and historical patterns of exploitation. Implementation that emphasized local control over specific outcomes, while royal authority provided framework and resources for achieving mutually beneficial results that demonstrated respect for regional autonomy within territorial cooperation. Framework that could serve as model for addressing similar conflicts throughout territory, while establishing precedent for problem-solving that honored both royal authority and local independence through practical collaboration rather than hierarchical dominance. The conversation had evolved into genuine consultation about governmental policy, transforming mandated observation into authentic advisory relationship, where both participants contributed perspective and expertise toward solving problems that required combination of royal resources and practical understanding of human motivations that transcended political theory. As weeks continued, similar evolution occurred across multiple aspects of royal administration, where Kaya's outsider perspective challenged assumptions while offering alternatives that served efficiency and justice simultaneously. Her presence had gradually shifted from unwelcome intrusion into valuable resource for examining policies that might benefit from fresh evaluation, despite successful operation according to conventional standards. "Lady Kaya," Prince Eriks said during evening meeting that had become regular conclusion to administrative days, filled with complex decisions requiring careful balance between competing interests. Your assessment of territorial governance effectiveness has proven more valuable than initial circumstances suggested possible. Thank you, Your Highness, though I must acknowledge that observation of your administrative capabilities has similarly challenged my assumptions about royal character and governmental complexity that external criticism rarely encompasses adequately. Indeed, though I remain curious about source of courage that enabled direct challenge to royal authority, despite obvious risks that such honesty created for personal safety and family welfare, that depended upon royal mercy rather than inherited protection. Courage that emerged through recognition that authentic existence requires truth-telling, regardless of consequences, while comfortable survival through diplomatic evasion serves neither personal integrity nor social justice that requires honest evaluation of power relationships and their effects upon vulnerable members of society. And such commitment to authentic existence transcends personal safety considerations when challenging authority that possesses power to destroy anyone who threatens comfortable arrangements through inconvenient truth-telling. Such commitment recognizes that personal safety without authentic existence represents comfortable slavery rather than genuine life, while truth-telling serves justice that benefits everyone through honest examination of power relationships, regardless of immediate consequences for individual welfare or comfort. As conversation continued revealing philosophical foundations that guided their respective approaches to responsibility and authority, deeper understanding developed between advisor whose honesty challenged conventional wisdom, and heir whose burdens required support that court flattery could not provide through diplomatic courtesy designed to avoid uncomfortable realities. "Kaya," Prince Eric said, with use of personal name that acknowledged intimacy their professional relationship had developed despite formal origins. What specific changes in royal behavior or administrative policy would best serve territorial welfare according to honest evaluation, unconstrained by diplomatic considerations about royal feelings or political consequences? Changes that emphasize service over dominance, cooperation over coercion, justice over convenience through governmental approaches that earned loyalty, rather than demanding submission while protecting vulnerable, rather than merely maintaining comfortable arrangements for powerful interests. Specific implementation of such principles within practical constraints of territorial governance that requires effective authority for maintaining stability while addressing complex problems affecting hundreds of thousands of subjects whose welfare depends upon decisive leadership. Implementation that demonstrated authentic strength through consistent application of justice, genuine protection of vulnerable through systematic attention to their welfare, and earned authority through results that served community interests rather than convenient maintenance of traditional power relationships that protected establishment while oppressing others. And personal assessment of royal character based upon weeks of intimate observation of decision-making processes and administrative behavior that diplomatic courtesy normally conceals behind comfortable assumptions about leadership effectiveness. Personal assessment that royal character demonstrates authentic commitment to territorial welfare, despite inherited authority that could serve personal convenience rather than community justice, while administrative capabilities exceed anything external criticism suggested, despite legitimate concerns about systematic effects of hierarchical power structures. The honest evaluation provided perspective that conventional advisory relationships could never offer through diplomatic constraints that protected royal comfort while preventing constructive examination of leadership effectiveness. Such truth-telling served mutual understanding that enhanced both advisory value and royal development through relationship based on respect rather than fear. Furthermore, Kaya continued with conviction that demonstrated growing confidence in professional relationship that had transcended artificial origins. Observation reveals that apparent cruelty represents controlled response to pressures and responsibilities that would overwhelm anyone lacking strength to maintain authority, necessary for territorial protection, rather than personal preference or intimidation over cooperation. Controlled response that protects both royal household and territorial stability through careful management of power that could become destructive if exercised without appropriate restraint. Prince Eric's acknowledged with admission that revealed understanding of dangerous forces that royal authority contained through conscious choice, rather than natural limitation. Control that requires constant vigilance against temptations toward easier solutions that might serve immediate convenience, while creating long-term problems for territorial welfare that depends upon sustainable governance, rather than expedient dominance through coercive authority that serves powerful interests exclusively. As mutual understanding deepened through honest communication that served both advisory effectiveness and personal connection between individuals whose cooperation had evolved far beyond artificial origins of royal command, external pressures began manifesting that would test whether authentic relationship could survive political complications that threatened established order through successful demonstration of alternative approaches to authority and service. 6 months later, the morning brought news that transformed routine administrative day into crisis, requiring immediate response from royal authority, whose effectiveness would be evaluated not only through conventional measures of governmental success, but through principles of justice and service that advisory relationship had helped clarify, despite complex practical constraints that implementation would face. Rebellion in Eastern Province, Captain Aldrich announced with grim efficiency that emphasized severity of situation requiring royal attention. Territorial governors report organized resistance to tax collection and military recruitment that threatens regional stability while inspiring similar opposition throughout territory. Assessment of rebellion's scope and organizational capability that determines appropriate response strategy, Prince Eric's asked with professional focus that demonstrated preparation for exactly such crisis, despite hope that effective governance would prevent systematic opposition to royal authority. Assessment indicates coordination between multiple settlements with leadership that suggests military experience and strategic planning, rather than spontaneous uprising, driven by temporary grievances that negotiation could address through conventional diplomatic accommodation. Recommendations for addressing organized resistance that serves territorial stability while maintaining justice, that honors legitimate grievances alongside necessary authority for regional protection and administrative effectiveness. Conventional recommendation emphasizes immediate military intervention that suppresses resistance through demonstration of royal power, while establishing consequences that prevent similar challenges to territorial authority, despite underlying causes that motivated initial rebellion against established governance. The traditional approach offered efficiency through proven methods that had maintained territorial stability for generations, despite human cost, that systematic suppression created among those whose grievances received violent, rather than administrative attention through governmental responses that prioritized order over justice. Alternative approaches that address underlying causes while maintaining necessary authority for territorial protection, Prince Eric's asked, with attention that demonstrated influence of advisory relationship that had emphasized service over dominance through systematic examination of governmental effectiveness, according to principles that honored both stability and justice. Your Highness, Kaya interjected, with voice that carried conviction despite recognition that her suggestion might challenge conventional wisdom about appropriate responses to threats against royal authority. What if resolution emphasized listening rather than suppression, understanding rather than intimidation? Listening to organized rebellion that threatens territorial stability through systematic resistance to royal authority? Captain Aldrich asked, with tone that suggested such approach represented dangerous weakness, rather than authentic strength through governmental response that served justice alongside necessary order. Listening to grievances that inspired rebellion while demonstrating royal commitment to justice that serves all subjects rather than merely maintaining convenient arrangements for powerful interests, Kaya replied with framework that balanced practical necessity with principles that had guided governmental reform through advisory relationship. And if such listening reveals legitimate concerns that require administrative changes while rebellion continues threatening regional stability through violence that endangers innocent lives alongside challenging royal authority, then royal authority demonstrates authentic strength through addressing legitimate concerns while maintaining necessary order that protects innocent lives from violence, regardless of its political motivations or claimed justifications for systematic resistance to established governance. The discussion had evolved into examination of fundamental principles that would determine not only immediate crisis response, but broader approach to territorial governance that either served justice through authentic authority or maintained convenient stability through systematic suppression that protected establishment interests while oppressing vulnerable subjects whose welfare deserved equal consideration. Looking toward Prince Eric's, whose expression revealed internal struggle between conventional approaches that offered certain effectiveness and alternative methods that served principles their relationship had developed through months of honest evaluation and mutual respect, Kaya realized that her truth-telling had created consequences that extended far beyond personal relationship to influence Gavi. Earn mental philosophy that would affect thousands of lives through royal decisions about authority and service. The Omega, who had refused to fear royal intimidation, had discovered that authentic relationship could inspire governmental reform, while Prince, who had learned to trust honest advisor, had found courage to choose justice over convenience despite political risks that such choice would create for traditional authority structures that served establishment interests through systematic oppression. Disque. Iced as necessary order. Their partnership would face its ultimate test through crisis that demanded choice between conventional dominance and authentic service, between comfortable authority and dangerous justice, between maintaining established power and earning legitimate loyalty through governmental effectiveness that honored both strength and vulnerability equally. 5 years later, the Great Hall had been transformed for the annual Assembly of Voices, an institution that would have been unthinkable during the era of absolute royal authority, but had become cornerstone of territorial governance under the reformed constitutional monarchy that King Morvain's shocking decree had ultimately inspired through systematic evolution of governmental philosophy, guided by principles of service and justice. Kaya stood at the speaker's podium, where she had been invited to address representatives from across the territory, who gathered annually to evaluate governmental effectiveness and provide input about policies affecting their communities. No longer the uncertain Omega who had challenged royal authority through desperate honesty, she had evolved into confident advisor whose perspective helped shape legislative approaches that balanced necessary authority with systematic attention to subjects' welfare. 5 years ago, she began with voice that carried confidence earned through experience rather than inherited through position. This hall witnessed moment when truth challenged power and sparked conversation that ultimately transformed our understanding of authentic authority and its proper relationship to those it serves. The assembled representatives, nobles and commoners, alphas and omegas, traditional leaders and reform advocates, listened with attention that demonstrated respect for perspective that had proven valuable through consistent results, rather than theoretical appeal to abstract principles that might sound impressive while failing practical implementation tests. What began as individual refusal to demonstrate fear has evolved into systematic examination of how governance can serve justice, rather than merely maintaining convenient arrangements for those who benefit from established power structures. She continued with assessment that acknowledged progress, while recognizing ongoing challenges that required constant vigilance against tendency toward comfortable oppression. Today, we gather not as subjects submitting to authority, but as citizens participating in governance that recognizes our shared responsibility for territorial welfare and individual dignity that authentic leadership must protect through policies that serve everyone, rather than privileging powerful interests at expense of vulnerable members. From royal seats where King Morvain observed proceedings with satisfaction that his controversial decision had produced results exceeding anything conventional wisdom could have predicted, approval was evident despite recognition that reformed governance required more complex management than absolute authority had demanded through simple enforcement of hierarchical obedience. Prince Eric's, now Crown Prince, whose authority had been tested and refined through 5 years of advisory relationship that had evolved into partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice, rose to address assembly with perspective that demonstrated how leadership could develop through honest evaluation and constructive challenge rather than comfortable isolation from criticism. The transformation that royal advisor Kaya describes began with courage to speak truth in presence of authority that preferred comfortable flattery. He acknowledged with voice that carried genuine appreciation for relationship that had shaped his understanding of effective leadership through systematic examination of assumptions about power and its proper exercise. But transformation required more than individual courage. It demanded institutional willingness to examine established practices according to principles that honor both necessary authority and individual dignity through governmental approaches that serve justice rather than convenient maintenance of traditional arrangements. Over these 5 years, we have discovered that authentic strength emerges through service rather than dominance, that legitimate authority requires consent rather than coercion, and that sustainable governance depends upon systematic attention to all citizens' welfare, rather than privileging powerful interests through policies that protect establishment convenience. The Crown Prince's words reflected evolution that had transformed apparent antagonists into partners whose cooperation demonstrated how honest communication could serve both effective governance and personal growth through relationship based on truth, rather than diplomatic evasion designed to protect comfort, while avoiding uncomfortable realities about power relationships. Recent crisis in Eastern Province provided ultimate test of reformed governmental philosophy. Crown Prince Eric's continued with reference to rebellion that had challenged territorial authority, while providing opportunity to demonstrate whether new approaches could address systematic opposition through justice rather than suppression alone. Instead of responding with conventional military force that would have suppressed symptoms while leaving underlying causes unaddressed, royal administration chose listening that revealed legitimate grievances requiring administrative attention, alongside necessary maintenance of order that protects innocent lives from violence regardless of political motivations. Resolution through combination of policy reform that addressed economic injustices and targeted enforcement that prevented violence while preserving space for legitimate protest has produced stability that serves justice, rather than merely maintaining convenient arrangements for powerful interests through systematic oppression of vulnerable populations. The successful crisis management had demonstrated practical value of governmental philosophy that had emerged through advisory relationship, proving that alternative approaches to authority could achieve better results than traditional dominance while serving principles that honored both effectiveness and ethics, through policies that protected everyone's legitimate interests. As afternoon session continued with reports from regional representatives about governmental effectiveness and suggestions for continued improvement, conversation flowed according to patterns that would have shocked observers from earlier era when royal authority demanded submission, rather than inviting participation in democratic processes that honored both leadership and citizenship. Royal Advisor approached Minister Garrett during break between formal sessions. What assessment do you offer regarding territorial transformation and its sustainability, despite pressures from neighboring kingdoms, whose governance remains based on traditional hierarchical authority that might threaten reformed system through military or political intervention? Assessment that sustainable transformation requires constant vigilance against comfortable regression toward convenient authority that serves establishment interest rather than justice, while defensive preparation acknowledges that reformed governance must demonstrate effectiveness that inspires loyalty through results rather than demanding obedience through intimidation. And confidence level regarding continued cooperation between royal authority and democratic institutions that balance necessary leadership with citizen participation in governmental decision-making. Confidence that emerges through 5 years of successful cooperation that has produced better results than either absolute authority or pure democracy could achieve independently, while recognition that such balance requires ongoing commitment to principles over convenience, despite pressures that might encourage expedient abandonment of reformed approaches. As evening approached and formal sessions concluded with planning for implementation of citizen recommendations that had emerged through democratic consultation, Kaya found herself walking through castle gardens with Crown Prince Eric's, in reflection upon transformation that their unlikely partnership had inspired through systematic application of principles that seemed simple, but required constant effort to maintain against easier alternatives. Kaya, he said, with use of personal name that acknowledged intimacy their professional relationship had developed, while respecting boundaries that preserved both effectiveness and propriety. Honest assessment of royal character development over 5 years of advisory relationship that has challenged every assumption about appropriate leadership behavior. Assessment that reveals authentic strength that was always present, but required proper expression through service rather than dominance, justice rather than convenience, protection of vulnerable rather than maintenance of comfortable arrangements for powerful interests, she replied with perspective that honored both personal growth and structural reform that their cooperation had achieved, and personal satisfaction with advisory role that has evolved far beyond anything royal decree initially anticipated, despite artificial origins that neither of us chose voluntarily. Personal satisfaction that emerges through recognition that individual courage to speak truth can inspire systematic transformation when authority chooses service over convenience, while authentic relationship between advisor and leadership can serve both governmental effectiveness and personal fulfillment through cooperation based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical dominance. As they continued walking through gardens where evening light created atmosphere of peaceful reflection upon achievements that had required both individual courage and institutional wisdom to implement successfully, conversation turned toward future challenges that would test whether reformed governance could survive pressures that traditional authority might generate through opposition to democratic innovations. external threats from neighboring kingdoms, whose absolute authority feels threatened by successful demonstration of alternative governmental approaches. Crown Prince Eric's acknowledged, with realistic assessment of political environment that surrounded territorial borders, alongside internal pressures from establishment interests that might prefer convenient regression toward traditional hierarchy. High that protected powerful while oppressing vulnerable populations. Threats that require defensive preparation while maintaining commitment to principles that have produced superior results through governmental effectiveness that serves justice, rather than merely maintaining stability through systematic oppression disguised as necessary order. Kaya agreed with framework that balanced practical necessity with philosophical commitment to reform. Though such preparation must avoid becoming excuse for abandoning democratic institutions through emergency measures that might seem expedient, while actually representing retreat toward comfortable authoritarianism that serves establishment convenience rather than territorial welfare. Looking toward Castle, where evening light suggested ongoing governmental activity that served citizen welfare through systematic attention to everyone's needs, rather than privileging powerful interests, they both understood that their partnership had achieved transformation beyond anything individual courage or royal authority could have accomplished independently through cooperation that demonstrated authentic strength. The Omega, who had refused to fear intimidation, had discovered that truth-telling could inspire governmental reform when combined with leadership willing to choose service over convenience, while Crown Prince, who had learned to value honest advisory relationship, had proven that authentic authority could emerge through systematic attention to justice rather than comfortable maintenance of hierarchy. Cal dominance. Their unlikely partnership would continue serving territorial welfare through governmental philosophy that honored both necessary authority and individual dignity, while democratic institutions they had helped establish would face future challenges that would test whether reformed governance could survive pressures from those who preferred convenient oppression to demanding justice that served everyone equally. The words, "You don't scare me," had indeed shocked everyone, not through their audacity alone, but through their ultimate consequences that transformed territorial governance from system serving powerful interests into authentic democracy that honored both strength and vulnerability through cooperative leadership, that earned loyalty rather than demanding submission through intimidation disguised as legitimate authority. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.